Hi, and welcome to episode 1 of my new series for the Lotus Eaters, Brokenomics. Many of you will be meeting me for the first time, so just to introduce myself, my name is Dan. I'm not been a podcaster before. In fact, I was pretty much an establishment character for the last 20 years. I worked in the city, in venture capital, also some asset management. And what I worked on was emerging technologies and digital trends, investing in those. And in 2020, early 2020, I went into semi-retirement, thinking that I'd done my bid. Then the world went completely mad. All of what happened over that period infuriated me and enraged me. And I talked about all of it through my social media. And probably the bit that I was able to add the most value on was the massive money printing that happened at the time. So I only had a little Twitter account, maybe 300 followers on that. And at the beginning of lockdown, I started pushing back against a lot of this stuff. And that quickly grew to whatever it is now, like 17,000 people when I was talking about these issues. That then resulted in me appearing on people's podcasts, going on radio shows, talking about these issues. Because what I was saying is that the effective demolition of our financial system was going to cause huge disparities in our system. It was going to drive enormous amounts of wealth to those people who earn their way through life by living off capital, and it was going to drive wealth away from people who earn wages. I found this so infuriating that I had to start pushing back against it in any way that I could, and that resulted in me ending up here. So what this series is about is, well, on the face of it, it's going to be an economic series. But really what it's going to be about is all the ways that you're getting screwed over by the system. And there is no doubt that you are, but we're going to give the language to describe that. I think a lot of people understand that things are going very wrong, but they lack the framework to describe what it is that's happening. Now, we know something is wrong because just compare yourself to your parents' generation. We've had since then 30 years of technological progression. And what is technology supposed to do? It's supposed to be labour saving. It's supposed to make us richer. And yet, these days, if you're my age, you probably need 2 incomes to maintain yourself in mortgage debt effectively forever. If you're a younger person, it seems unlikely that you'll ever get on the housing ladder. And even if you're an older person and you have this home that you bought for 12k back in 1965, and that's gone up significantly at this point, well, actually, you're no better off either, because you need that house to live in. And the things that you really want to buy are things like retirement income, an annuity. And those have been crushed as well. So at every level, we understand that we are getting screwed over by this system. But there has been genuine economic growth over the last 30 years. So where has it all gone? Who has benefited from this? That's something we're going to be talking about. I'm actually reminded of a meme that's doing the rounds at the moment, which I quite like. It's the Homer Simpson meme. I'll see if we can find it and throw it up on screen. And it's something like this. It's saying, back in the 90s, we used to think that Homer Simpson was a loser. But we look at him now and we realise, well, he had a house, a detached house. He could afford several holidays. He had a stay-at-home wife. He held down a long-term job. By today's standards, he's not looking like so much of a loser, is he? And indeed, if you go back to the mid-90s, a house back then, in today's money, so not what it would have costed you at the time, but in today's money, a house would have cost, the average house in the UK was 114k. Today, it's 300k. And that's just the most obvious example of how the benefits of the last 30-odd years have flowed to capital. I pick houses because it's an example that we're all aware of, but you can run the same numbers with basically any asset that can't be printed stocks and bonds and other financial instruments, land, for example, and you're going to find the same picture as in houses. Now, of course, back then in the mid-90s, interest rates were higher than they are now. But all the same, on that house, which is, as I mentioned, 114k in today's money, that would have only cost you £750 a month in today's money for a repayment mortgage. Whereas today, that same 750, I had a quick look on Rightmove earlier, the best that's going to get you at this point is a one-bed flat to rent. So let's see if we can start to unpick this. But before I do, there's one meta concept that I want to introduce. And that is, I would like you to start thinking of money as language. Now, the way I describe this is that there are two fundamental mediums that permeate everything that we do in society. Now, both of these mediums, they are signalling mechanisms. They tell us what's important. They tell us what to pay attention to. They tell us who and what is valuable. And those two mediums are language and money. Language gets all of the attention. That's what 98% of the journalists spend their time talking about. It's what the politicians spend their time talking about. All the pundits, the guy down the pub. We're all very comfortable getting into the debates around free speech and censorship. But this other signalling mechanism is at least as powerful. And nobody understands how to speak in that language. So a whole other half of the dialogue is happening all around us. And nobody is really addressing what's going on there. And when you understand how to interpret the signals that the money system is giving us, the whole other half of the conversation opens up to you. And all of a sudden, news events, which may seem incomprehensible, suddenly become clear. So, to pick one of many examples, why is it that even right-wing governments are so keen to enable mass immigration? Doesn't seem to make any sense on the face of it. It would seem to be hurting their electoral prospects. When you understand the needs of our current monetary system, that becomes clear. Not to mention when you get onto the geopolitical angle, which we'll touch on a little later, around conflicts that might be happening around the world. So this series is going to try and help you to understand this language of money. Now, I ought to stop there really and give a very brief history of the money system to set you up for the rest of what we're going to be talking about. So I describe it like this, and this is going to be very cut down, but it gets us to the point. So for thousands of years, for money, people chose gold and silver. Then we come to World War II. Many things happened during World War II, but one of the things that happened was the US ended up with most of the gold at the end of it. And somebody, probably an American, decided that they would like to keep all of that gold. And so in a roundabout way, we got a new system emerged, the Bretton Woods system. And the idea for that was that it was okay, the US could keep the gold, and the dollar would become the new global exchange currency for the world. But don't worry about it, because at any time you want, you can exchange those dollars for gold. We had a very similar system in the UK as well. In fact, let me put out an example. If you look at a banknote, you see just under the top there, where it says Bank of England, there's a little line that says, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £10. That used to be on dollars as well. It got taken off more recently. And the reason for that is because there was a time when you could walk into a bank, you could slide your £10 across the counter, and you could get the £10 worth of gold. But then in 1971, that changed. The US defaulted on its debts, and it did that by breaking that link between the paper money and the gold. Now, I mentioned that I worked in the city. I did a whole bunch of professional exams while I was there. And one of the things that I was taught is that the US and the UK has never defaulted on its debt. This is plainly untrue. Because in 1971, when Richard Nixon stood up that night on television and explained that he was breaking that link, you went from a situation where your debts, if you were owed money by the US government, you were still, to be fair, going to get paid back the same number of dollars. But those dollars were worth much less because that link with hard money had been broken. And everything that's happened in the last 50 years on the monetary world is basically a fallout from that decision. And effectively, we're reaching the end of that process now. So a purely fiat-based monetary system had been born. Now, what that did, amongst other things, is that it gave money to new superpowers. First of these was it gave governments the ability to deficit spend. They had always had this ability to a limited extent before this, but the brakes were really off at this point. So a politician could do more public spending than he was raising in taxes, basically in perpetuity. And he could pay for the difference in debt, and he could then simply shove that debt onto the next generation of politician. And that guy, he didn't mind either, because he could simply take that existing debt, he could add his own debt to it, again, spending more than he earned, and roll it on to the next generation. And so these governmental debt piles piled up year on year, with governments becoming ever increasingly irresponsible. It's got to the point where in this year, 2022, the US government was set to spend $6 trillion. But it was only going to collect $4.2 trillion in revenues, so leaving it with an enormous deficit of $1.8 trillion. To put that in perspective, the US total debt is now $31 trillion, which is about 90 grand for every US citizen, which is enough to buy everybody in the US a Porsche 911. And that's just counting the official debt levels. It doesn't even count the unfunded liabilities, such as their Medicare costs and other things as well. So that was a fundamental change that happened. And the other superpower that money got was the move to truly fractional reserve banking. Again, this was something that had existed before, but in a far more limited form. And now it could truly accelerate. And it works something like this. So let's say you have £100 and you pay that into your bank, and the bank has a reserve requirement of just 10%. What that means is that it needs to keep £10 in reserve, and it can lend out the other £90. So then somebody else gets that £90 and they pay that into their bank. And then that bank has to keep back 10%, so £9, and can lend out the other 81, and so on and so on. And what actually ends up happening is that £100 gets turned into £1,000 if you play this out. So if you think that you have money in your bank account, you probably don't. You probably have somebody else's credit. Now, what this set up was continuous expansion. Most of what we think of as money is actually just credit. This was described really well by a guy called Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio is a very successful hedge fund manager. He ran one of the world's largest hedge funds. And he had a similar reaction to me to the 2008 crisis. He started talking about some of these issues then. And he did some calculations around this. And he came to the conclusion that the total amount of credit in the US system was 50 trillion, but the total amount of money was only 3 trillion. Now, obviously, those numbers have grown quite considerably since then. But when you look at it like that, it starts to become very obvious why these debt levels can never be repaid. Indeed, it's actually a lot worse than that. Not only can the debt not be repaid, but the interest on the debt cannot be repaid without creating more money to pay the interest. So we've got ourselves into a situation where the monetary base, the total amount of money, must always expand. Otherwise, it will go into a deflationary collapse and pull the whole thing down, which, as tempting as you might think that is, it would actually be pretty disastrous. Reason being, is that money is the other half of every transaction that takes place. So you would get a complete collapse in supply chains and everything, unless you had a viable alternative to take over. Now, at that point, you might be thinking, well, you're telling me that this system is fundamentally flawed, but you've also told me that it has been working since 1971. So how can you explain the last 51 years? Because it seemed to more or less work for that time, didn't it? And that's a fair challenge. There were a couple of things, a couple of big trends that allowed this system to survive as long as it has. So the first of these is going to be demographic expansion. If you have an expanding monetary system, if you also have a massively expanding demographic picture, it can cloak the ill effects of this. So what did you have in 1970? Well, you had the boomer generation. That was the largest generation that the Western world has ever seen. And in the 70s, they were all entering the workforce at the same time, getting their first job, buying their first suit, first car, first home. Following that, you had more and more women entering the workforce, especially in the later part of the 70s, the 80s and the 90s. And you also had the globalization effects. You had China and India entering the global workforce. So you had this huge demographic expansion that made an expanding monetary system significantly more viable. Of course, that's no longer the case. There is no longer any Western population growth. There are no third genders entering the workforce. You know what I mean. There are additional genders entering the workforce, but it's not a net positive. You always lose a slightly confused man or woman every time one of them does come in. So that doesn't count. And it doesn't look like there's going to be any new continents joining the global workforce. Possibly Africa could fit that bill, but for various reasons, I don't expect that to happen. So the demographic drivers have dried up. But there's a more fundamental problem as well. The economic model itself has changed. Now, what do I mean by that? For many years, the economic model was effectively more. It was capital expansion. It was open another factory, open another store, hire another employee. This continuous capital expansion. And probably one of the best examples that I can give of that, which you'll all be familiar with, was, say, Blockbuster Video. Now, in 2004, they had reached their peak. They had 9,000 stores all over the world. They had 80,000 staff. They were the epitome of the more and more model. And then what happened is Netflix overnight changed the marginal cost of distribution for videos to zero. And all of a sudden, those 9,000 stores went from being an asset to being a liability, a cost they had to cover, which didn't provide any additional benefit. Now, that's just one example of many. I mean, you can think of, if you're an older person, the times that you would have gone in to get your photos developed. None of us do that anymore. We've got effectively free photos on our phone. There are many examples. So technology is deflationary. Indeed, you can think of Silicon Valley as a whole as a group of people who are focused on getting the marginal cost of the world's largest industries down to zero. So technology has flipped that capital expansion model into a cost efficiency model. So both of the fundamental drivers that for 50 years allowed an expanding monetary system to work, both of those have now been turned off. So what we're left with is an absolute web of contradictions. The money supply must always increase, but there's no demographics or globalization. There's no capital expansion in order to support that. And that's something that really started to hit in the early 2000s when the technology revolution, the internet revolution, really started to affect us. which led to the 2008 crisis, which is effectively when interest rates hit zero, so the ability to stimulate additional money growth at that point could no longer continue. And there simply weren't enough people who were interested in buying this government debt in order to support governments at that level. And that's effectively what quantitative easing is. Quantitative easing is when governments buy their own debt, which creates liquidity and it pushes money out into the system. So we refer to it as money printing, and technically it's more liquidity, but it serves the same function. So since 2008, there's been increased amounts of money printing happening. And then because that was basically a counterforce to the deflationary effects of the technology revolution, effectively the internet revolution, it looked like that we had a stable period because the two forces were effectively cancelling each other out. Except it seems that there was some sort of monetary crisis in 2019 where the world's financial system understood that it needed to interject an awful lot more money into the system. Conveniently, around that time, we had the COVID crisis, and it provided the perfect set of excuses to significantly increase quantitative easing at that time to pump a lot more liquidity into the system. But then, of course, because money is half of every transaction, if you increase the amount of money in the system, but you don't increase the other half of that equation, the total amount of goods and services, clearly you're going to get inflation. The price of those goods and services is going to have to increase to represent the fact that it's being denominated by a larger second half of the equation. And that's where we are now. We're in a period where inflation is rising. And this causes a lot of people who don't quite understand the system to think that it's going to be just like the 70s all over again, where we were able to crush this high inflation by increasing interest rates. But of course, it's no longer the private banking system that is creating all of this additional money. It was that government printed it. So you can set interest rates to whatever level you like. They're not going to undo that money printing that has already occurred. And there are other problems with it as well. So unlike the 70s, it's now the governments themselves who own all of this debt. After the Great Financial Crisis in 2008, basically governments backstopped their banks by taking the debt up a level to the sovereign, to the government level. So they're not in a position to increase interest rates to the point where they can effectively collapse economic demand to the point to cancel out this inflation, because in doing so they increase their own borrowing costs and governments will bankrupt themselves. So what have they done? What have central banks and governments done? They've effectively snookered themselves at this point. They've left themselves with very few viable options. And it is this that is going to drastically, well, it is already drastically impacting your life, but it's going to become all the more obvious and all the more painful over the next couple of years. And I feel it's really incumbent on myself to offer explanations as to why this is happening, because you are not going to get these explanations in the mainstream media. You are going to be fed a pack of lies, effectively, as to what's going on. And in all of that, I've just talked about the system in a very narrow sense. What I haven't talked about is the geopolitical angle, and that's also hugely important. Do you remember what I talked about back in the 1970s when the dollar became a purely paper-based system? And I keep referring back to the dollar because we live in a world which is effectively dollar-based. So when I talk about the dollar, it applies just as much to the pound as well. We are, effectively a dollar proxy. So I tend to talk just in terms of dollars. But yeah, in the 70s, when the dollar became a paper-based system, for a few years, it sort of floundered a bit. It didn't really have much to purchase against. And somebody came up with a genuinely brilliant system, which was the petrodollar. And I have to explain this because it goes into it explains so much of geopolitical events. So we can throw up this slide, which effectively describes what we're seeing. So with a petrodollar system, the requirement is that anybody who buys or sells energy anywhere in the world has to do that in dollars. And the way they were able to implement this system originally was they went to the Saudis and they gave them security guarantees. Effectively, they would keep the House of Saud in power in perpetuity if they agreed to sell their oil in dollars. The House of Saud agreed to this, and then the US gently encouraged the rest of the world to follow suit, to also adopt the petrodollar system. And the deal there was effectively, look, no pressure, you can do this, or you can get invaded. Entirely up to you. And the world went over to this new system with a couple of holdouts who got invaded. And it's brilliant. So say you're the world, you want to buy energy. In order to do that, you're going to need dollars. So you get those dollars, you can then sell your energy or buy your energy, and then you can buy goods from the world and so on. So that global system works because it's modern economies are energy-based systems. So how do you get those dollars? Well, you have to basically send things of real value to the US in exchange for those dollars. So there is a constant demand for dollars to be generated. So what does the US do? Well, it issues very large amounts of debt, especially short-term debt, which is a very effective way to get dollars or near dollars into the system. So effectively, the US created a tribute system where they could give the world debt, pieces of paper, dollars, in exchange for the world sending the US real things. It is a system that has effectively allowed the US to have free energy for much of the last 40-odd years. So it's an absolutely brilliant system. It is a tribute system. I remember thinking when I was a young man watching the invasion of Iraq and the jingoistic news coverage that we had at the time, the overwhelming political might that they had. I remember thinking back then, wow, the US could take over the world if they wanted to. The fact that they don't must mean they're the good guys, right? And that's certainly the messaging that we're getting out of media and movies all of the time. What I didn't understand back then is that they don't need to take over the world, because with this petrodollar, effectively a tribute system, the world is paying them all the time, is all the time sending them real things in order that they can get paper dollars back in exchange. So it's an absolutely brilliant system, but of course it's one that is less popular with everybody else, particularly at the moment with what's going on. And that's, again, something perhaps for a later video. But there is now pushback because, of course, this system can only last as long as the US is the unipolar power in the world. As long as they are the global superpower, you can have a system like this. But the moment they aren't, people are going to reject it. Now, it is looking increasingly that China will overtake the US quite soon in terms of economic power. And of course, where economic power goes, military power tends to follow reasonably close behind. So once you understand that these financial drivers are also moving geopolitical events, you have a completely different perspective on a whole series of wars that have happened in the past. So I mentioned the Iraq War. I would point out that Saddam Hussein, shortly before the invasion began, announced his intention to leave the petrodollar system. So whatever I thought the reasons for the war at the time, and back then, I largely accepted what the mainstream media was telling me. Now I look back on it with a very different view. You might also want to look at what somebody like Gaddafi was saying about the US dollar and about how he was trying to form a sort of Pan-African alternative to that, again, shortly before military intervention. And that's just one of a number of examples. So this links through to not only events in, well, the monetary system leads not only to events in domestic politics that might seem bizarre, but it also very much explains much of what's going on in global politics as well. So where is this going to get us? So I've put together a simple slide which perhaps explains, what alternatives we have. And we don't have a lot of alternatives, really. Obviously, the monetary system that we have is going to fail at some point. It's a question of when, not if. So what do? Do we go back to gold? I spent much of the last 20 years being a gold bug. I believed that this probably was where we were going to return. I increasingly doubt that. I'll do a video explaining exactly what's going wrong, what my concerns are there. But essentially it comes down to a centralization or a trust issue. So explain it like this. You either need to have one party, you need to have them centralize all of the gold so that they can count it and verify it. And in the current system, that would probably be the US. And that's exactly what led into the situation that we're in at the moment. Or you let everybody keep their own gold and you trust them on how much they say they have. So you would be in the situation where China needs to trust the US when the US says how much gold it has, and vice versa, in order for a global money system like this to work. So you can see why that's not going to work. There's talk of a BRICS currency. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa. They're getting together and they're looking at having a commodity-based global money. Again, it has some of the problems that I mentioned before and other problems. You don't really want to be using viable economic resources as a store of value. You have the solution that the World Economic Forum is pushing, which is central bank digital currencies. Terrifying things. I'm sure you've heard a lot about them. I've spoken a lot about them on other podcasts, and we'll certainly be getting into that because that would effectively mean at least 2 generations of digital slavery. There's possibly something like Bitcoin, although it's probably not ready at this point. So there are no viable alternatives, and it's much for that reason that I think that the current system that we're in is going to drag on for quite some time, because there simply is no viable alternative at the current time. But that's not going to last forever. I suspect personally, and I could be wrong on this, I suspect that the end of the decade is going to be the crunch point for a lot of this stuff. And we need to make sure that we are going into that crisis, understanding how we got into it. So what this series is going to do is it's going to pull apart all of those themes. It's going to explain why we're in this mess. We're going to talk about how it's going to affect you. These numbers just don't add up anymore. And we're going to note that the elites recognise this as well. In fact, I can show you sources that will clearly show that for those willing to see, it has been obvious for at least 20 years that this system cannot last, and that it is going to necessitate change. And that is the reason why the elites are looking at draconian solutions. So they're pushing hard currently on digital IDs. They will then roll that into central bank digital currencies. And they're going to do that, their Great Reset agenda, not because they're trying to deliberately crash the financial system. The financial system is going to crash all by itself. But what they're doing is they're making sure that they have the toolkits, that when that collapse comes, they have the power to stay in charge, to stay wealthy on the other side of that collapse. So that's why I'm doing this. The reason I got into spreading these messages, talking about this, podcasting, and of course now joining the Lotus Eaters, is because I feel that we are getting close to the end game. this is our last opportunity, because when you go into a big crisis, typically what happens is you get a new rule set that comes out the other side. And if you go into the crisis with the wrong assumptions, then of course the rules that you put in place following that crisis are going to be the wrong rules. So we need to make sure that before we get to that point, as things get worse and worse over the coming years, that people start to understand exactly why things have gone wrong, so that they can push back. And ultimately, of course, what we want is a world where the state has been separated from money, which would drastically reduce the power of the state. And the alternative is as we've talked about, it's going to be that digital slavery route. It's going to be social credit systems. It's going to be central bank digital currencies, which are going to ensure that you are surveilled at all times, and that your behaviour can be behaviourally modified. They can say that you can only buy a certain amount of red meat, or you can only put a certain amount of petrol in your car. You can only fly a certain number of times a year. It gives them almost perpetual and total control over all of us. And personally, I'm kind of 60-40 on whether we're going to get the good outcome or the bad outcome. And it fairly regularly flips around for me, whether I'm 60% positive or 60% negative. But we need to win this fight. I have children, and I want to make sure that they have a future that's worth growing up on. I don't want to quit the West, but I think we have to fight for it at this point, and that's what this series is going to do. It's going to give you all of this. If you follow this series, you are going to be able to talk about all of these big events that are happening in the news more expertly than I would say 90% of journalists and politicians, because most of these people simply don't understand what's going on at the moment, or they're in hock to some set of cliched answers that simply doesn't describe it. So that's what this series is going to be. I should point out, none of it's going to be financial advice, but what it will be is explaining financial concepts so that you can make your own mind up on a lot of this stuff. I'm going to focus on being functionally correct over technically correct. So, I've already done this a bit in this video. I'll talk about, say, for example, quantitative easing as money printing, and technically it's liquidity, but it serves the same purpose. And actually what's important is that you understand the gist of what's happening. That's what we're going to do. We've got lots of great videos coming. I think the next one has to be on interest rates, because that's effectively what has precipitated this crisis. Interest rates were, of course, significantly higher in the past. They walked down to zero in 2008, and that triggered a crisis, because you can't go lower than that. And everything since then has been a reaction against it. Of course, at the moment, we've got central banks trying to raise interest rates, thinking that they can undo government money printing from 2 years ago, and that's not going to work. We need to get into what happened in 1971 in a bit more detail, because that was really the crisis that triggered it. It got Nixon and the whole set of American politicians out of a bind back then, but it set up everything that's gone wrong since then. We need to talk about the types of money, because it's clear we're going to need new systems. So let's properly explain how a gold system or a Bitcoin system or some of these other alternatives might work. We can talk about the Great Reset. That's quite an advanced agenda at this point. We could talk about geopolitics and so much of these things that are happening. And you end up with a completely different perspective on, like I say, current affairs and wars past and present. And of course, I also want to be responsive to audience questions. So if there's something that you want to see covered, please drop that down below. But I think this is going to be a really interesting series. And I'd love to hear what you guys are thinking about and what you're looking to learn. And I think we're gonna cover some really good ground. So look forward to seeing you in the next one.